Zalika stood at the edge of the baobab forest, watching the fires of N'Kulu burn in the distance. The ancient trees loomed behind her like silent guardians, their twisted branches reaching toward a blood-red moon. She ran a finger along the double-bladed spear strapped to her back, and Nyoka, the serpent, feeling it pulse with warmth beneath her touch. "Are you certain this is wise?" The voice came from beside her, thick with the scent of palm wine. M'Bain swayed slightly as he approached, the magical gourd hanging from his belt gurgling with disapproval. His eyes, despite the haze of drink, remained sharp and questioning. 3 scars ran from his left temple to his jawline, marks of some past life he refused to discuss. "Wisdom has nothing to do with it," Zalika replied, her voice like cooling ember. "It is necessity." "Necessity," huffed the gourd at M'Bain's hip. "Necessity would be running in the opposite direction. The king has eyes everywhere. His juju masters can smell rebellion in the wind." M'Bain tapped the gourd harshly. "Quiet, you cursed thing. Your advice has nearly gotten me killed 17 times. Yet here you stand," the gourd gargled. Zalika's eyes never left the distant palace, its golden domes gleaming with malice against the night sky. 23 years she had waited, trained, and planned. 23 years since her mother, the priestess Moel, had been violated by Obá N'Kulu and cast into the chasm of forgotten souls. As she died, Moel had whispered a curse into her newborn daughter's ear, a curse that became Zalika's first memory. The forest spirits had found the infant, crying beside her mother's corpse. They took her into the shadows, raising her on darkness and rage. They taught her to speak with the dead, to bend shadows to her will, to read blood like others read water. And always, always, they reminded her of her purpose. "The king's festival of renewal begins tomorrow," Zalika said. "Every noble house will attend. Every guard will be watching the crowd, not the performers." M'Bain drank deeply from his gourd, wiping his mouth with exaggerated care. "And you think they'll simply allow a wandering entertainer and her fool into the inner circle?" She turned to him then, her eyes reflecting nothing. "They will. Because you will make them laugh, and I will make them dream. And when they are lost in laughter and dreams, I will begin turning their hearts." The spirits had warned her that her father would sense her coming. Blood called to blood, even blood tainted with hatred. But she had prepared for this, carrying talismans of bone and ash to mask her presence. For as long as possible, she would be nothing more than a shadow in his periphery. "He bathes in the blood of virgins tonight," she said, her voice hollow. "I saw it in the fire. He thinks it will strengthen him against the coming darkness." M'Bain shuddered. "The stories they tell in the villages, they say he drinks from the skulls of former friends. That he has lived 3 lifetimes through dark magic. The stories understate his cruelty," Zalika whispered. "The spirits have shown me his chambers. The walls weep with the souls of the tortured. His appetites grow as his body should be failing him." They began their descent toward the kingdom, following a narrow path carved into the volcanic rock. Below them, the kingdom of N'Kulu sprawled like an open wound against the earth, golden temples surrounded by mud huts, splendor built upon suffering. "You could kill him quickly," M'Bain suggested, "not for the first time. A poison dart, a blade in the night." Zalika shook her head. "Death is too merciful. I must unmake him, as he unmade my mother. I must turn his people against him, his guards against him, the very stones of his palace against him. Only then, when he is alone and afraid, will I reveal myself as his doom." M'Bain sighed and took another swig. "Well, then. Let's go entertain a tyrant." The gourd at his hip made a sound like bubbling laughter. "At least the wine will be excellent before we die." As they approached the kingdom gates, Zalika pulled her hood lower. In the shadows cast by torchlight, her eyes briefly glowed with ancestral fire, the only sign of the storm building within. The festival of renewal transformed N'Kulu into a riot of color and noise, masking the suffering that sustained it. Drums pounded like heartbeats while royal dancers moved in synchronized devotion to Obá N'Kulu. In the center of the grand plaza, a golden throne loomed atop a pyramid of polished black stone. Upon it sat the king himself. He was not what Zalika had expected. In her dreams, she had seen a monster, a creature bloated with evil. But the man before her appeared almost ordinary, tall and lean, with skin like burnished copper and a face that might have been called handsome if not for the cold emptiness behind his eyes. Only the network of dark veins visible beneath his skin hinted at the corruption within. "Behold the light of N'Kulu," a royal announcer proclaimed. "Obá the everlasting, chosen of the gods, master of life and death." The crowds cheered with practiced enthusiasm. Zalika noted the guards watching the faces in the crowd, marking those whose applause seemed insufficient. "They're terrified," M'Bain whispered beside her. For once, he appeared entirely sober. "Look at their eyes." Zalika nodded. Fear saturated the air like incense. The nobles closest to the throne wore masks of joy that cracked at the edges, revealing the terror beneath. Even the king's advisors kept their gaze low, afraid to draw his attention. "We're up after the fire dancers," she said, adjusting her performer's garb. She had painted her face with symbols that seemed merely decorative but were ancient wards against magical detection. "Remember. Make them laugh so hard they don't notice you weaving your spells," M'Bain finished. "I know my part, Shadow Daughter." The gourd at his hip whispered, "We should have stayed in the forest," but M'Bain silenced it with a sharp tap. When their time came, M'Bain bounded into the performance circle with exaggerated clumsiness, immediately launching into a routine that mocked the neighboring kingdom's customs. His physical comedy drew genuine laughter, a sound so rare in N'Kulu that it seemed to confuse the royal guards. Zalika followed, dancing with ribbons that traced complex patterns in the air. What appeared to be artistic flourishes were in fact binding sigils, ancient symbols that weakened barriers between worlds. As she danced, she sent her consciousness outward, touching the minds around her. She whispered directly into their thoughts, "Remember freedom. Remember dignity. Remember when Obá was just a man, not a god. Remember." On his throne, Obá N'Kulu shifted uncomfortably. He leaned toward an ancient advisor wrapped in leopard skins, murmuring something that made the old man pale. When Zalika completed her dance, the king stared directly at her, a gaze like black fire that seemed to pierce her disguise. "Bring the female performer to me," he commanded, his voice surprisingly soft for one so feared. Royal guards moved through the crowd. M'Bain shot her a panicked glance, but she gave an imperceptible shake of her head. This was always a possibility, her eyes told him. Follow the plan. In the king's private chamber, golden statues depicted Obá N'Kulu as different deities. Incense burned in human skulls, and the walls were decorated with tapestries showing his supposed divine exploits. Behind his smaller, private throne, a curtain of beaten gold concealed what Zalika knew to be his ritual chamber, the place where his dark magics were performed. "You dance with unusual intent," the king said, studying her with eyes that had witnessed centuries. "Where did you learn such patterns?" "I learned from the wind and the river, Great One," Zalika replied, keeping her voice melodic, her eyes downcast. The king laughed, a sound like stones falling into a deep well. "You lie beautifully. Almost as beautifully as you dance." He stood, circling her with predatory interest. "There is something familiar about you. Have you performed in my court before?" "Never, Great One. I come from beyond the volcanic plains." He stopped directly behind her, and she felt his breath on her neck. Every fiber of her being screamed to drive Anyoka through his heart, but the spear was hidden with her true clothes, and the time was not yet right. "Your presence disturbs the air in my palace," he whispered. "It ripples like water touched by an invisible stone." He moved to face her again, and for a terrifying moment, Zalika thought he recognized her. His hand reached toward her face, then paused. A strange expression crossed his features, not suspicion, but something almost like recognition, quickly buried beneath royal indifference. "You will stay in N'Kulu," he declared. "Your performance pleased me. You and your fool will be given quarters in the outer palace." It was not a request. Zalika bowed, hiding the cold smile that briefly touched her lips. "You honor us beyond measure, Great One." As royal attendants led her away, she felt the king's eyes burning into her back. In the shadows between torches, she allowed herself a moment of doubt. He sensed something, the blood connection between them, perhaps. She would need to work faster than planned. That night, as M'Bane snored in their new quarters, Zalika crept through the sleeping palace. In the servants' quarters, she whispered to dreamers, planting seeds of rebellion. In the guards' barracks, she left tiny spirit fetishes that would slowly erode their loyalty. And in the royal harem, where the king's unwilling concubines lay in fearful silence, she taught them songs of power disguised as love ballads. By dawn, she had touched a dozen minds, kindled a dozen small flames of resistance. But as the sun rose, casting long shadows across N'Kulu, Zalika felt a presence in her own dreams, watching, questioning, reaching for her with desperate hunger. Her father knew someone was coming. He just didn't yet know it was his doom. A week passed in the palace of N'Kulu, each day a careful performance. Zalika danced for nobles while M'Bane made them laugh, and in between, they carefully seeded discontent throughout the kingdom. Small acts of defiance began appearing, symbols of resistance etched into walls, guards suddenly forgetting to punish minor infractions, slaves walking with straighter backs. Obá N'Kulu noticed. His punishments grew more severe, more public. 3 royal guards were flayed alive for failing to bow deeply enough. A cook was fed to the sacred crocodiles for a dish that displeased him. Fear thickened in the palace like smoke, but beneath it burned something new, resentment turning to rage. "He's getting suspicious," M'Bane whispered as they prepared for another performance. The magical gourd at his hip had been uncharacteristically silent lately, sensing the danger surrounding them. This morning he executed his oldest advisor, accused him of plotting against the throne. Zalika nodded. "The king's sleep is troubled. I've been entering his dreams, planting doubts, memories of his victims. His juju priests are working day and night to protect him, but they cannot shield him from his own blood." She glanced at her hands. "The connection between us grows stronger as I draw closer. He feels me now, though he doesn't understand what he's feeling." That evening, as Zalika performed before the court, she saw the change in Obá N'Kulu. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and the magical veins beneath his skin pulsed with sickly light. He watched her with naked suspicion, his fingers drumming against the golden armrests of his throne. When she finished her dance, he stood abruptly. "Enough. Guards, seize her." Zalika had prepared for this moment. As the guards approached, she dropped a small clay bead that shattered against the marble floor. Thick smoke billowed outward, and in the confusion, she vanished, not fleeing, but deeper into the palace, toward the king's private chambers. Behind her, she heard M'Bane creating additional chaos, his voice carrying above the shouts, "A demon! A demon in the court! Everyone run!" The ensuing panic was perfect cover. Zalika moved like a shadow through secret passages the spirits had revealed to her. The palace was built on old burial grounds, and the dead had shared their knowledge freely with one who could hear them. She emerged in the king's ritual chamber just as the alarm horns began to sound throughout the palace. The room reeked of blood magic. Bones and fetishes hung from the ceiling, and the walls were painted with symbols so dark even Zalika's forest teachers had forbidden their use. At the center stood an altar of obsidian, stained with countless sacrifices. Working quickly, Zalika removed a small pouch from around her neck. Inside was a mixture of her own blood, earth from her mother's grave, and ash from the sacred fire. She began marking the altar with symbols of unmaking, chanting softly in the language of the ancestors. "I thought you might come here." The king's voice froze her in place. He stood in the doorway, alone, without his guards. Up close, the magical corruption was even more evident. His eyes had turned completely black, and the veins beneath his skin writhed like living things. "You have been whispering to my people, turning them against me," he said, his voice eerily calm. "At first, I thought you were sent by my enemies beyond the mountains. But now I see the truth." He stepped closer. "You have her eyes. Moyle's eyes." Zalika straightened, abandoning her disguise. "You remember her name, then? The priestess you violated and murdered?" Something like pain flashed across Obá N'Kulu's face. "I have known many women across many lifetimes. But her curse has haunted me. She promised her vengeance would grow in my shadow." His black eyes narrowed. "You are the child." "I am her vengeance," Zalika replied, her hand moving to the hidden blade at her waist. Not Enyoka, the spear remained hidden outside the palace, but a dagger coated with paralytic poison. The king laughed, a sound that raised goosebumps on her skin. "You think I haven't prepared for this moment? I have seen you in my dreams for years, a shadow with a face I could never quite glimpse." He raised his hands, and the fetishes around the room began to rattle. "Your mother's blood runs in your veins, but so does mine. We are connected, daughter. I can feel your heartbeat as if it were my own." He lunged with supernatural speed, his hands closing around her throat. Zalika drove her dagger into his side, but he didn't flinch. The poison that should have dropped him instantly seemed to have no effect. "Your blood is my blood," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Your power is my power. Did you think the forest spirits could prepare you to face a living god?" Outside, the sounds of chaos grew louder. Shouts and the clash of weapons suggested something larger than her capture was happening. The revolution she had carefully seeded was erupting prematurely. As Zalika struggled in her father's grasp, the room suddenly darkened. A familiar voice called out from the doorway. "Let her go, you immortal piece of dung." M'Bain stood there, swaying slightly, the magical gourd raised in his hand. For once, his eyes were completely sober, burning with purpose. "The fool comes to die," Obá N'Kulu sneered, but his grip on Zalika loosened just enough. She drove her knee into his stomach and broke free, gasping for air. "Run, M'Bain. This isn't your fight." "Actually," M'Bain said, his voice dropping its usual joviality, "it is." With surprising grace, he hurled the gourd at the king. When it shattered against Obá N'Kulu's chest, it released not wine but a swarm of biting spirits, tiny creatures of smoke and bone that covered the king's body, each bite stealing a fragment of his stolen power. The king screamed, clawing at his flesh as the spirits burrowed beneath his skin. "We need to go," M'Bain said, grabbing Zalika's arm. "The palace is in chaos. The royal guard has turned on each other, and the slaves have armed themselves." As they fled the chamber, Zalika glanced back to see her father on his knees, surrounded by a storm of vengeful spirits. Their eyes met one final time, and in his gaze she saw something unexpected, not hatred, but recognition. And perhaps, beneath the pain and rage, a flicker of relief. The uprising had begun, but her true work, the ritual that would end Obá N'Kulu forever, was yet to come. 3 days of fire and blood transformed N'Kulu. The palace lay in partial ruins, its golden domes blackened by smoke. In the streets, former slaves fought alongside rebel guards against those still loyal to the king. M'Bain had emerged as an unlikely leader, his humor and courage rallying people who had lived too long under the tyrant's shadow. But Obá N'Kulu himself had escaped the initial uprising, retreating to the one place Zalika had known he would go, the Temple of Bones, an ancient structure predating even his long reign. Built into the side of an extinct volcano at the kingdom's edge, it was said to be where he had first acquired his dark powers. "He's preparing a sacrifice," Zalika told the rebel council gathered in what had once been the royal audience chamber. "The spirits whisper that he's taken 300 captives, children mostly, to feed his final ritual. Horror spread across the faces around her. Even those who had lived under the king's cruelty for decades were shocked. "What does he hope to achieve?" asked a former noble, his fine clothes now torn and stained with soot. "Rebirth," Zalika replied grimly. "The ultimate transformation. If he completes the ritual, he won't just extend his life again, he'll become something beyond human, beyond death itself." She looked at the assembled leaders. "I must go alone to face him." Protests erupted immediately. Bane slammed his fist on the table, his magical gourd, somehow reconstituted after its sacrifice in the king's chamber, sloshing angrily. "Absolutely not," he declared. "We have 2,000 fighters ready to storm that temple and end this nightmare." "And they would all die," Zalika said softly. "The Temple of Bones is protected by magic older than N'Kulu himself. Only blood of his blood can pass freely." She touched the double-bladed spear strapped to her back. Enyoka hummed with anticipation, sensing the coming confrontation. "This was always my destiny. My mother saw it before I was born." That night, as the rebels prepared for a frontal assault to distract the king's remaining forces, Zalika slipped away. She found Bane waiting for her at the city gates, the magical gourd hanging at his hip. "If you think I'm letting you face that monster alone, you've inhaled too much ritual smoke," he said before she could object. "The gourd has been giving me good advice for once. Says I'm supposed to see this through with you." The gourd bubbled indignantly. "What I said was we should flee to the southern islands and live as wealthy drunks, but he never listens." Despite everything, Zalika smiled, a rare expression that transformed her severe features. "You've already done more than I could have asked, Bane. The rebellion would have failed without you. Save the eulogy for after we're dead," he replied with a wink. "Besides, someone needs to tell this story properly. Can't have the court poets turning you into some weeping princess who forgives all at the end." They traveled through the night, taking hidden paths through volcanic fields where steam hissed from cracks in the earth. By dawn, they stood before the Temple of Bones, a massive structure carved directly into the mountainside, its entrance framed by the skeletal remains of ancient creatures. "Well," Bane said, staring up at the grinning skulls that decorated the temple facade, "at least the decor matches the name." Zalika approached the entrance, where magical barriers shimmered like heat waves. She drew a knife across her palm and pressed her bleeding hand against the invisible wall. The barrier recognized her blood and parted like water. "Stay behind me," she told Bane. "The temple will tolerate your presence as long as you're with me, but stray too far and the defenses will awaken." Inside, the air felt thick and metallic, charged with dark energy. The walls were not built of stone but of compressed bone, thousands, perhaps millions of skeletal fragments fused together through forgotten arts. Torches of green fire lit a path deeper into the mountain. They encountered no guards, no priests, only silence broken by distant, rhythmic chanting that grew louder as they descended. The temple seemed to breathe around them, walls pulsing almost imperceptibly. "He knows we're here," Zalika whispered. "He's always known I would come." The central chamber of the Temple of Bones was a perfect circle carved from volcanic glass. At its center stood Obá N'Kulu, changed from when they'd last seen him. The ritual was already underway, his body had elongated, skin splitting in places to reveal glowing magical veins. Around him, in concentric circles, knelt hundreds of captives, mostly children, bound and marked with sacrificial symbols. When he spoke, his voice echoed as if multiple beings were speaking through him. "Daughter. You arrive at the perfect moment. The final ingredient in my ascension will be your life force, the perfect symmetry of creation and destruction." Zalika unsheathed Enyoka, the double-bladed spear glowing with ancestral fire. "Release the captives, father. This is between us." The thing that had been Obá N'Kulu laughed, the sound reverberating painfully in their skulls. "Nothing is just between us. My power comes from sacrifice. Always has." He gestured at the captives. These children will give their futures so that I might have eternity. Zalika moved forward, Enyoka held before her. Behind her, she heard Mbain quietly beginning to move among the outer ring of captives, using a small knife to cut their bonds while the king was focused on his daughter. You have lived too long already, Zalika said, continuing her approach. 3 centuries of torment and suffering. The spirits cry out for justice. The spirits? The king sneered. I conquered the spirit realm before your grandmother's grandmother was born. They are my subjects as much as these humans. As they spoke, Zalika began a subtle movement pattern with her feet, not advancing directly, but tracing sigils on the chamber floor. The king noticed, black eyes narrowing. Ah, the shadowcraft Mwail was so proud of. Did the forest spirits teach you her ways? Did they tell you how she begged at the end? His twisted face formed something like a smile. She was powerful, your mother. Her curse has been the only magic that ever truly threatened me. But even curses fade. Not this one, Zalika replied. In a fluid motion, she drew a vial from her belt and smashed it at her feet. The chamber plunged into absolute darkness, a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the king's magical fires. In that perfect blackness, Zalika moved with certainty, guided by years of training in the forest's deepest shadows. She heard Mbain working faster now, freeing more captives and guiding them toward the exit. When light suddenly returned, Obá N'Kulu found himself alone in the center of the chamber, his sacrifices fleeing. Zalika stood directly before him, Enyoka's twin blades pressed against his throat. It ends now, she said. But the king only laughed. My dear, naive child. It has barely begun. With inhuman speed, he seized the spear shaft, ignoring how the blessed metal burned his flesh. Dark energy pulsed from his hands, traveling up the weapon toward Zalika. The spear, her mother's spear, began to crack under the assault of his corrupted magic. Your mother thought she could defeat me with a curse, he hissed. You think you can defeat me with a weapon. Neither of you understood. I am beyond such things now. As Enyoka shattered in their hands, the explosion of released energy threw them both backward. Zalika hit the chamber wall hard, feeling ribs crack. Through blurred vision, she saw her father straightening, his transformation accelerating without the captives. He was drawing power directly from the temple itself. Now you see, he said, advancing toward her. This was always your destiny, to return to me, to complete me. Your death will fuel my final transformation. As hope began to fade, Zalika heard a voice, not Mbain's, but a woman's, speaking directly into her mind. The ritual goes both ways, daughter. Blood calls to blood. Understanding flooded through her. She had approached this as combat when it was always meant to be sacrifice. As Obá N'Kulu reached for her, Zalika did not resist. Instead, she pressed her bleeding palm against his chest, directly over his heart, and began the incantation her mother had whispered into her infant ears, not a curse, but a key. What are you doing? The king demanded, suddenly uncertain. He tried to pull away, but their blood had mingled, creating a bond he could not break. Blood calls to blood, Zalika said, her voice joining with another, older voice that seemed to come from the air itself. I opened the door you closed centuries ago, father. I return what was stolen. The chamber began to tremble. From the walls of bone, whispers emerged, thousands of voices, victims of the king's long reign. They grew louder, more insistent, until they became a deafening chorus of accusation. For the first time, Obá N'Kulu showed fear. No. I conquered death. I conquered the beyond. You borrowed time, Zalika corrected, still holding him fast through their blood connection. Now payment is due. The bones in the walls began to glow, pulsing with ancestral light. And from that light stepped a figure Zalika recognized from her visions, a tall, regal woman with eyes exactly like her own. Mwail. Her mother. Obá N'Kulu fell to his knees before the spectral form of Mwale. The temple shuddered around them, dust and fragments of bone raining from the ceiling. The king's carefully constructed immortality was unraveling, centuries of dark magic collapsing under the weight of justice. Impossible, he whispered, his voice suddenly human again, stripped of its supernatural resonance. I destroyed you. I scattered your ashes. Mwale's spirit stood before him, radiating cold light. When she spoke, her voice carried the collective power of all the king's victims. You cannot destroy what is eternal, tyrant. The body dies. The spirit remains. Zalika stood transfixed, seeing her mother's face clearly for the first time. The resemblance between them was unmistakable, the same determined jaw, the same penetrating gaze. But where Zalika's eyes held cold purpose, Mwale's contained something more complex, sorrow mingled with resolution. Mother, Zalika whispered. Mwale turned to her daughter, her expression softening. You carried my vengeance faithfully, child. But vengeance was never the true purpose. Confusion crossed Zalika's face. I don't understand. The curse, your dying words. Was not a curse but a prophecy, Mwale replied. Not just his ending, but a new beginning for our people. The king laughed bitterly, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth as his stolen years began claiming their debt. Always so righteous, Mwale. Even in death. He turned to Zalika. She never told you, did she? Before I took her by force, she was my high priestess. She served me willingly for decades. I served the throne of N'Kulu, Mwale corrected sharply. Not the monster you became. I believed in the kingdom's purpose until you corrupted it with your greed for immortality. Around them, more spirits were materializing, victims of the king's 3-century reign, their forms composed of bone light and memory. They formed a circle around Obá N'Kulu, silent witnesses to his final moments. Mbane appeared at the chamber entrance, having safely evacuated the captives. He stopped short at the sight of the ghostly assembly, the magical gourd at his hip trembling in supernatural terror. I, missed something significant, didn't I? He managed, eyes wide. Zalika barely heard him. She was focused entirely on her father, who seemed to be aging rapidly before her eyes. The dark veins beneath his skin were fading, the unnatural strength leaving his limbs. Without his magic, he was just a man, old, frightened, and alone. Kill me and be done with it, the king spat, looking up at Zalika with hatred. Complete your mother's vengeance. Zalika raised her hand, a shard of the shattered Anyoka clutched in her fist. One quick stroke and it would be over, justice delivered, her mother's spirit avenged, her life's purpose fulfilled. But Mwale's spectral hand gently caught her wrist. Death would be mercy he doesn't deserve, she said softly. And it would bind you to him forever through the act of killing. There is another way. Understanding passed between mother and daughter. Zalika nodded slowly and lowered the blade. No death, she agreed, her voice steady. Something more fitting. She knelt before Obá N'Kulu and placed her palms against his temples. Their blood connection, which he had tried to use against her, now became his prison. Zalika began to chant, not in the language of curses or death, but in the oldest tongue of memory. What are you doing? The king demanded, panic rising in his voice as he felt her consciousness intertwining with his. Stop this. I am not taking your life, Zalika explained calmly. I am taking your legacy. Through their connection, she began extracting not his life force but his memories, 3 centuries of experience, knowledge, triumphs, and sins. She pulled them from his mind one by one, examining each briefly before releasing it into the waiting spirits that surrounded them. No! Obá N'Kulu screamed, understanding his true punishment at last. Kill me instead. Please. But Zalika continued methodically. She took his memories of conquest, of pleasure, of power, and most painfully, his memories of adoration. Every moment when he had felt like a god, every act that had built his monstrous legend, all of it extracted and dispersed into nothingness. When she finally released him, Obá N'Kulu collapsed to the floor, alive but vacant. He breathed, his heart beat, but the man who had been king was gone. In his place remained only an empty vessel with no past, no identity, no knowledge of his own name. Mwale's spirit approached her daughter, pride evident in her luminous eyes. It is finished. Around them, the Temple of Bones began to collapse in earnest, the centuries of dark magic no longer sustaining its impossible architecture. M'Bain rushed forward, grabbing Zalika's arm. "Touching family reunion," he said urgently, "but this entire mountain is about to come down on our heads." Zalika looked to her mother one last time. "Come with us." Mwale shook her head gently. "My time ended long ago, daughter. I remained only to see this moment." She gestured to the empty shell that had been Obá N'Kulu. "Take him. Let the people see what remains of their living god." As the spirits began to fade, returning to their eternal rest, Mwale's form lingered a moment longer. "The throne is broken," she told Zalika. "Do not try to claim it. N'Kulu must find a new way forward, not through blood or birth, but through choice." Zalika nodded, tears streaming down her face for the first time since childhood. "I understand." M'Bain hoisted the mindless king over his shoulder. Philosophical revelations later, escaping certain death now, he insisted. They fled through collapsing corridors as the Temple of Bones folded in upon itself. Behind them, the spirits of the king's victims found peace at last, their collective energy dismantling the site of so much darkness. 3 days later, Zalika stood before the people of N'Kulu in what had once been the royal plaza. M'Bain stood beside her, for once completely sober, the magical gourd silent in respect for the moment's gravity. At their feet knelt the empty shell of Obá N'Kulu, unrecognizable now as the tyrant who had ruled for centuries. "The king is ended," Zalika announced, her voice carrying to the thousands gathered. "Not dead, but unmade. His body will live out its natural days, but the man you feared is gone forever." She gestured to the vacant-eyed figure.